Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, and I'm joined by No, I'm not joined by Charlie this week. Charlie is off in Austria doing important technical things. Instead, I am joined by the wonderful Shane Carlson. Shane, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, a fun story about how I'm here is Charlie and I share the same hairdresser. As she recommended, we both, could be interchangeable when it comes to conversations like this. Actually, fun story. I've known Charlie for, I think, going on 20 years now, and we've had a lot of similar conversations over the years. So it was a great opportunity to kind of step in and play Charlie for a day. But by way of background, as you said, I'm Shane Carlson. Currently, just made a career move as a director of pre-sales strategic services at Airtable. Previously spent the
Congratulations.
last, thank you. It was an exciting move for me. And previously spent the last 7 years at ServiceNow in the platform space, doing large scale transformation, pre-sales architecture, leadership, and a lot of years in management consulting and other things, IT infrastructure prior to that. So don't let the lack of gray hair fool you. I shave it all off so nobody sees it. I've been working since the AS400 and mainframe days.
AS400s, yes, it's odd being at this point where you've spent 20, 25 years in tech and time flies, right?
It does. It does. I love telling stories about the early days of tech.
Yes, but we're here to talk about last week's stories in tech. Uh, Coming up to the here and now, obviously, we've had a lot of challenges and a lot of interesting issues coming up over the past week. And I think one of the most interesting stories that have come up that I've definitely been talking about with my tech contacts is around the new OpenAI model, O1, which just came out last week. And it's a bit of a different paradigm than the traditional large language models, as traditional as anything 2 years old can be. But there's really a different approach to this model where it thinks more about reasoning and doesn't necessarily just spit out an immediate response. So I was curious what you thought about that, Shane, and how people might be using this.
Yeah, it's absolutely hard not to talk about in tech circles right now. This is something I think the pace of innovation from OpenAI around their language models and the additional ability to handle complex multi-turn conversations has been something I think everyone in tech is solving for with the use of AI, especially generative AI, to drive conversation, question answer, summarization. Um, and get to the point where, like you and I having a conversation, we can multi-thread different topics and different conversations and kind of bring those things into the conversation, and it makes the burden of having to be a good prompt engineer as an end user less of a burden because you can speak to AI the way I would speak to you. And we're getting closer and closer to AI understanding the cadence, the context, the complexity of human thought and human conversation to where you don't necessarily have to be an expert to get the answers you're looking for. Now, I think there's always going to be space for optimizing prompts and how we interact with AI to get exactly what we want and fine tune the result. But I think we're getting closer and closer to what I would call a human level conversation, or what a lot of people I think refer to as the concept of general intelligence around how we interact with AI and how AI interacts with us more.
Yeah, I find it interesting how the O1 model is really focused on chaining multiple kind of lines of thought together to create a comprehensive response to a question. And sometimes this means that it is just blathering on for thousands of words to what seems like a relatively simple question because it doesn't quite know where to stop. But the flip side of that is if you want a comprehensive answer that you might use to define a process or to look at a multi-threaded or multi-departmental response to a question, O1 might actually be your best step or your best starting point. You just have to wait 15, 30, 45 seconds for an answer instead of getting that immediate half second response that we're used to getting from the likes of GPT and other more casual consumer grade LLMs.
Yeah, I think the key there is I think they're starting to build for not general use cases, but thinking about the way enterprises are going to use this type of intelligence and these type of LLMs to solve business use cases. And I think some of the smartest answers I've ever gotten from humans followed a 15 to 20-second pause where they were
Mhm.
composing their thoughts about how they wanted to answer in a very thoughtful way. So I'm okay with waiting for a better answer if that means the quality is going to be better. And I think over time that's going to speed up as the model optimizes. It gets more interaction with the general public and a lot more end
Yes.
users.
And I'm also looking forward to seeing how this might mean that we are using different models for different use cases on a more practical and general basis. We might end up having a monitor of models or a model of models over time where each use case and each question actually leads to a different model or different type of retrieval. All the stuff that we're talking about with the retrieval and tuning and data access is really honestly very primitive at this point. We just kind of shove
It
everything
is.
into one place and hope that we get the right response because honestly, this Gen AI stuff is pretty smart at what it does, but it's not like we have this very sophisticated way of using these models at this point.
Yeah, and I think the way a lot of companies, especially, are solving for this in their own AI approaches is they're either going to one extreme or the other. They're either relying heavily on the general purpose LLMs to drive, very broad topical areas of conversation, or they're going very narrow on dedicated LLMs to get very specific responses about their own internal data, transactional information about their core platforms and systems, things of that nature. So something like an O1 could potentially be that middle ground that allows them to train on specific things within the model to get those more specific answers, but also have it be very broad to capture a variety of questions that could come to it.
Right. So for companies trying to go beyond that general LLM, we've obviously been hearing a lot of about agentic AI as well. Having just come from ServiceNow, you might have heard about this Xanadu release coming
Yes.
out, where there's actually been a lot of work on bringing agents into the platform. And I'm at Dreamforce right now, where obviously we're going to be talking a lot about Agent
Yeah.
Force over the course of the week. And
I'm
I
sure
was
Mark's
wondering,
going to bring it up once or twice this
once or
week at
twice,
Salesforce.
maybe. It has that marketing touch. But I
He
was
does.
curious because you are a former insider. You obviously did a fair amount of work on the Xanadu release, and I was curious how you thought about agentic AI and the use of agents in improving IT environments as well as operational environments.
Yeah, I think, the concept of agents in general has been something we've been chasing in tech for the better part of the last 15 plus years. And the concept of intelligent agents has been a very hot topic for 10 plus as we've started to look at, machine learning and traditional AI in terms of, threaded conversational patterns.
Mhm.
And then now with generative AI, it's a game changer for the concept of agent interaction. And I think as this continues to evolve, right, the whole point of agents is meeting people where they are, right? Whether that's in work, whether that's in life. No two people are going to necessarily interact with an agent in the same way. And you want those agents to be as close to the work that they're doing or the task that they're trying to accomplish as possible. And you also want the friction to be very low to interact with those agents. I would say prior legacy chat agents were very conversation based. If it understood the conversation you were trying to have, it was very good at taking you to a workflow or a series of tasks that it could execute on your behalf. As we moved into generative AI, the concept of an agent not needing a known conversation necessarily to drive action on your behalf has been transformational. And the whole point of an agent isn't just to answer questions for you, it's really to drive action on your behalf. And I think we're seeing a lot of this already entering the space. The Xanadu release with ServiceNow is obviously something that is a huge step forward in the concept of agents and how agents can be employed to serve and help and drive action on behalf of the user. And I assume we're going to see the same thing from Salesforce. But we're moving from this. I can do simple tasks with an agent to I can ask an agent to do things and take action on my behalf that are complex. Again, back to the conversation with O1. multi-threaded conversations, the ability to take action on several things in one interaction as opposed to having to do those serially along the way. So the ability to handle more complex actions on behalf of a user is something where I think we're rapidly entering that space, and we're going to see a huge improvement in how those agents work in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yes, but one of the things that got my attention is that I feel like the approaches are slightly different. That ServiceNow is looking at providing a library of agents, really giving you a lot of choice in which agents to use and how to deploy those and how to get work done. While Salesforce has been talking a little bit more about this new approach of creating large action models, these models that are used specifically to define action, as well as its execution engine. I feel like there's a little bit more of a focus on proprietary work at the end of the day, whereas ServiceNow has always had that platform approach to
Yes.
the open library approach. Similar approaches, but I see a little bit of nuance in how each company is working at this. And I also think this is very differentiated from the AI world in general, where almost everybody else in AI is really just focused on outputs and kind of
Yeah.
this conversational AI, which is hard to translate into actual work.
Yeah, the generative side of generative AI, right, is they're just trying to create content and conversation and things of that nature. To your point about the differences in approach, and I no longer work for ServiceNow. I definitely don't speak on their behalf, but I think they've been very clear about their approach to AI, especially generative AI, in a very dedicated contextual point of view of the work that happens within the different parts of their platform and the different products. They definitely want to make sure that the agents are very focused, because you're not just going to ever be exposed to a general ServiceNow agent, either as a customer, a partner, a employee, etc., that says, "Tell me what you need." You're typically going into an agent conversation through the lens of a specific workflow or action that you're trying to take, and that agent is there to help you with, say, your IT or HR or work I need to do my job as an employee versus work I'm doing on behalf of a customer or work that I'm doing on behalf of a partner. All of those LLMs are very dedicated and focused around the type of task that's being performed and the information that exists in the platform. And not only in the platform, but the LLM that's being trained on by tens of thousands of customers, millions of users who do similar transactional work to drive the same kind of action. From what I've seen of where Salesforce is going, as you said, they're taking more of that autonomous type of action to allow these agents to very broadly accomplish different types of work across the enterprise. I think both are very valid approaches to the space. I mean, we're all learning about AI as we go in the enterprise. We're learning about how people are using or looking to use bots. And I think both are going to absolutely have a space as we move forward. I think the question is going to be, if I'm a CIO, a CTO, or a business leader at a company today, I need to really understand the problem I'm trying to solve with these agents before I decide what path I'm going to go down and what I need to use.
Yeah. And speaking of kind of trying to solve problems, one of the biggest vendors in the IT space, of course, is Amazon. Amazon Web Services, hard to escape. 2% of the IT market, obviously a big favorite of developers, but they haven't always been able to create great tools for the average user. And it seems like this is starting to be an issue for them, especially with tools like Amazon Q and some other no-code tools that are supposedly created for the average user, but haven't necessarily translated to actual adoption. And honestly, this has been a bit of a trend because Amazon has a bunch of tools across things like analytics and productivity in theory, but let's be honest, who uses them?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, having been in the low code space on the ServiceNow side of the world for the last 7 years, and stepping in very recently and being baptized in the true no code world at Airtable, I think it's very hard for companies to build technology for non-technologists, right?
Hmm.
Things that are easy to use, easy to build on, easy to drive action with, easy to support outcomes with. And I think when you think of the concept of democratizing software development and putting powerful tools in the hands of the people who are best positioned to solve the problem, the users of the actual business processes, I think it's been very difficult for large companies, especially the Amazons, the Googles, and the others of the world, to figure out how do you make technology like that accessible to people who may not necessarily uh, be used to building sophisticated outcomes with technology and with software. So I'm not surprised that Amazon has failed to land, and get parity with some of the other no-code platforms that are out there for non-technologists, because it's a difficult space. It's something that the founder of ServiceNow, Fred Luddy, talked a lot about. It was the reason why he built ServiceNow in the first place, is to really put technology in the hands of people who could best use it to solve problems in the business. And companies like Airtable are trying to do that as well, and actually being very successful in a lot of spaces, driving things like product operations, digital media, content libraries, things of that nature that people who work in IT or developers aren't experts on, and they can only learn so much by sitting in a design session with an end user to understand the core of the problem. Where you have people who have been living and breathing these business processes for 10, 15, 20 years, who think about these things in their sleep and who know the answer, they just don't know how to use technology to solve that problem.
So I think we can take on two more topics, one around
Okay.
kind of Oracle Cloud world, and then
Mm-hmm.
finishing on Oprah, just to be
Good
something wacky.
choices.
All right. So last week we had Oracle Cloud World. This was an interesting show. It's always interesting to see what Larry Ellison is doing in the enterprise tech space. And apparently he has finally found cloud religion after all these years. As uh, and he's actually been doing an interesting job with this building out a hyperscaler. He he's not quite in the top three yet, but it's hard to ignore that Oracle Cloud exists. I don't know how much you care about that over Airtable at this point, but it does seem like he's at least getting some traction and figuring out how to work with the other hyperscalers.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see the transformation in Oracle over the last couple of years, especially in the cloud space, and truly embracing kind of a cloud first mentality, not only in the solutions that they're selling to customers, but in kind of their own core business as well. And I think if you go back 5 years ago, people would have not put their name in the list of top cloud oriented enterprise software companies. And I've had a number of friends who have actually gone over to work at Oracle in the last 2 or 3 years, and who had been at Oracle previously, kind of in the what I would call the legacy Oracle days for many years. And the sentiment I've gotten from all of them is it's a different company. The thinking is new, the thinking is modern. They're embracing transformation. They're looking at AI. So I would say they are very close to being on the verge of becoming a modern enterprise cloud company, much like many of their peers. And to see them wholeheartedly embrace things, especially like the multi-cloud approach that they announced recently, I think with people that they had seen as competitors in many cases coming into the last few years, is I think directionally the right thing for them as a company. I mean, you don't see too many companies of their tenure making these kind of large scale pivots at their size, so it's very heartening.
Yes, of course, with Oracle, it always starts with the database. Hard to avoid the
Of
Oracle
course.
database, but they at least realize they've got to be an Amazon, Google, Azure to really sell that database at the end of the day. And they are obviously dedicated to the resources necessary to maintain as a tech superpower. And
Yeah.
speaking of superpowers, Larry Ellison also made an interesting announcement around data centers and talking about building a nuclear-powered data center. And when asked whether he was serious about it, he said, "Oh yeah, totally serious about it."
Yeah, I think the one thing that many of us who have been in tech for 20 plus years have come to expect from Larry is big ideas that sound absolutely ridiculous when they're
Hmm.
first said, that become very normal, a few years or 10 years later.
Hmm.
It's interesting. I think, for me, it goes back to some of the sci-fi stories that I used to read as a youngster, where, we had shrunk down the size of nuclear reactors to, wristwatch size or battery
Yeah.
size. And this was a promise 40, 50 years ago in sci-fi that we never realized, because we went through a period where we became very fearful, especially in the US, around nuclear power after, some rightfully so, after some very close accidents and what we've seen at Fukushima and elsewhere. There's
Right.
this fear of the unknown risk that nuclear power poses. But I absolutely think, small scale nuclear reactors as a clean data source for things that are very, very power hungry, like data centers, especially is in the AI era of computing, where these data centers in many cases are consuming unbelievable amounts of power. And I think there was an article that came out very recently last week that said most data centers are very likely underreporting their carbon footprint and their power consumption by upwards of 600%. So
Hmm.
I think, as a leader, Larry is recognizing a challenge that as we continue to build data centers that are more and more dense and have more and more compute, we're going to continue to consume more and more power. And we need to find better ways, more sustainable ways of powering this computing power that we're continually increasing more and more and more.
Yeah,
So,
one of the things I wonder is just where Larry Ellison is going to build this thing. Obviously, it is hard to do nuclear in the United States, whereas honestly, when I think nuclear power, the first place I think is France, where they
mhm.
actually have a fair amount of nuclear power already. So I wonder if this means he's investing in the EU. Um, I'll just say that politically, Larry Ellison isn't necessarily well known for call it the more socialist policies that France has. But hey,
Yeah.
business makes for strange bedfellows sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure at this point, like Larry owns, several islands in the South Pacific and other places where he could test this theory. But I think, I mean, this follows on news in the science world, for years that they're trying to get to these compact room-size nuclear reactors
Yeah.
uh, for these very reasons. So I think, well, it sounds audacious in scope. I do think that we're very close to seeing that kind of technology. So it'll be interesting to see if Larry could be the first to start powering data centers with compact nuclear reactors, and where that
Yeah.
goes and what it means for the industry.
Yeah, and we've talked previously on this podcast about the idea of thirsty AI. That every single prompt or query ends up being basically a glass of water.
Yes,
Maybe a few ounces of water, but and how are we going to deal with that? Like both the power and water issues associated with AI are going to be pretty immense, and probably will lead
absolutely.
to IT managers actually having to look at the utilities associated with the services that they are procuring.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see it as an ESG line item on 10Ks at some point, right? What is your data center footprint? What is your power consumption footprint? How are you offsetting the carbon? How are you, ensuring that your power sources are sustainable? And so I think we'll see a lot of focus on this as AI becomes more and more mainstream.
Right. Oh, and of course, AI being mainstream, it is hard to avoid just how mainstream it is. It is absolutely at the top of that hype cycle, and nothing could say that more than last week's special that Oprah, of all people, did on AI. When Oprah covers your space, you know that you are top of mind for the mainstream. And she brought in some of the biggest names in AI, Sam Altman, Bill Gates. tech influencer Marquise Brownlee, who does all these fantastic device and consumer tech breakdowns. And it was interesting to see that we have gotten to the point where everybody can be an expert in AI now. Everybody can talk about how important this stuff is and how it affects the mainstream.
Yeah, I think the only way AI could have gotten more mainstream is if Taylor Swift incorporated into her Eras tour in some way. Which
Right?
actually, I'm sure if we dug deep enough, we would find an AI story that's powering the Eras tour. But yeah, like as you said, when Oprah covers your space, you know you've made it on the front page, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a very interesting topical discussion. Obviously, we in tech have been talking about AI for a lot longer than the last year plus since ChatGPT hit the scene. But I think, the Chat GPT becoming publicly available was the thing that got the general public starting to talk about these types of conversations and the implication it has on everyone's day-to-day life. And seeing Oprah have Sam Altman, in the interview chair, and Bill Gates and Marquise as well, who I absolutely have loved his YouTube channel forever. To kind of see all of these topics get woven into a very non-technical conversation uh,
Mm-hmm.
on everybody's television or computer screen is very, very interesting to see. I mean, I think many of us in tech feel like we're behind the scenes. Especially those of us who work for companies that are helping everyday companies deliver their services and products to their customers. You don't actually see technology in the spotlight unless it's a consumer oriented technology or something along those lines. So to see AI, and specifically Gen AI, become a massive topic of conversation in the general public is very interesting to see. And I would say lots of positives for that, but there could be some downside and some backlash to bringing that conversation into the mainstream.
Yes, as we were prepping for this call, one of the interesting points I think you brought up was how Sam Altman is starting to look like the villain. If you live long enough in tech, you will become the villain at some
Look,
point in your lifetime. We've seen
I
it
mean, we
with
can go
everyone
back to
from
Larry,
yeah.
taking it back to Oracle. Larry was the original, billionaire to be villainized at some point or
Mhm.
see his perceived as a villain. Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, I think they've all had their turn at being
Sure.
the bad guy, the harbinger of technical transformation that impacts everyday life. And now it's Sam's turn. It's very interesting. I think there's some industry chatter about what does it mean when Sam pulls himself out of the security committee for AI
Mhm.
oversight. What does it mean that as an industry we have yet to adopt standards around AI safety and governance? Again, we're early days in this, and I think there's an expectation that we're being very thoughtful from a technology point of view about how we use AI and how we use AI specifically to enhance human output rather than replace humans in the process. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how companies like OpenAI and others approach this.
Yes, and of course, AI companies want it both ways. They don't want any governance coming from federal or state governments, but they also want to be able to basically break copyright laws left and right, and don't want to be held accountable for anything that they've done. And those two sides are not going to work.
Yeah,
You're going to have to pick
you can't
something
have it
at the
both
end.
ways.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and I think, I mean, it's driving an interesting conversation, especially around copyright. Most of our copyright laws around the world are 100 years old or more, right? You've got some of the copyright acts were updated, in the 2000s, when we had the music sharing and the file sharing become mainstream. Every technical evolution drives a new level of conversation about how we need to revisit legacy thoughts and legacy regulations around how we manage things like intellectual property, people's personal data, all of these things. And I think having the conversation is great, but I also think that the leaders of these companies need to be out front, being a champion for just having the conversation so we get to the best outcome. Of course, nobody wants restrictions being put on their we're in the early stages of hyper growth. But the reality is if we in technology aren't willing to lead the conversation, we're going to have those restrictions put upon.
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's better to be able to figure out some way to cooperatively figure all this out. But it's going to be a mess between the data, the models, the logic, the training, the
Yeah,
augmentation, the ongoing support, the changes that are happening in these models on a weekly basis.
yeah.
There's a whole lot to juggle here. And I think we're a couple years away from even figuring out what a stable ecosystem looks like for enterprise AI.
Yeah, and as we know, regulators in most countries are not the most technology savvy, and
Yes,
they're all subject to the influence of the uh, uh, the folks who are piling money into their campaigns and giving them opinions on how they should feel about these sorts of things. So it'll be very interesting to see how we make it through this concept of regulation. Lobbyists on
yes.
all sides are going to be throwing large amounts of money into these influence campaigns to help people who are legislators decide how they feel about the legislation affecting something that is going to be, and already is, truly transformative to the world we live in. So,
Yes. So we've got Oprah and the politicians all giving their 2 cents. It's a wild time to be in tech right now. And with
yeah,
that, yeah.
it
And with
is. It
that, I'm going to
absolutely
call it
is.
a week. Thank you so much for joining me this week, Shane, to wrap up the stories and the topics and the launches that really made up this week in tech.
Anytime I can show up and be Charlie for a day, I'm happy to do so. I think that means it's 10 a.m. here. I'm going to go have a glass of wine. Isn't that what Charlie would do?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Uh, Thanks for joining us online. Please subscribe, please email us and let us know what topics we should be considering for next week. And thanks a lot for joining us.